Welcome to Disney Coast to Coast, a show celebrating and questioning one of the most beloved entertainment companies in the world through honest, passionate, and clear-eyed Disney discussions. I'm Jeff DePauli, your entertainment-obsessed host with rose-colored glasses removed. Today on the show, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Disney movie Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Did you grow up loving this movie, or were you like me and you'd actually never seen it? Listen as I share my feelings about seeing it for the first time, along with a conversation with my friend and author Aaron Wallace, who is a die-hard fan of the film. Plus, Aaron recently went on a Bedknobs and Broomsticks adventure as he visited the Walt Disney Studios lot in California for the first time for a special screening of the film, as well as flying to Europe to catch the first stage production of this book, translated to film and now translated for the stage. Plus, did you know that there's actually been Bedknobs and Broomsticks representation in the Disney parks? Let's hop on a flying bed together and talk about all things Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Grab the confetti and celebrate a Disney anniversary.
Hello, Aaron Wallace. Welcome back to Disney Coast to Coast to talk about one of your favorite things, Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me back on the show. And I'm so excited that you wanted to do this episode because, yeah, it is one of my favorite things, and I can't wait to talk with you about it.
Well, it was very much inspired by you because, number one, there are a lot of things that you grew up with that I did not, that you're like, you got to see it. And so I'm like, okay, first of all, this is an opportunity for me to talk about seeing Bedknobs and Broomsticks for the very first time. And I always love when there's a different experience coming where you grew up with it, it's been part of your life for a very long time. And not only are we going to talk about the movie, but you have gone on kind of a recent Bedknobs and Broomsticks adventure where you went to the Walt Disney Studios for the first time, I believe, to see it.
Correct.
And then you went to overseas to Europe to see it on stage. So we got a lot to talk about. I believe, so the movie came out December 13th, 1971. But Disney's kind of treating it as a 50th anniversary this year.
Yeah, so the date you just gave, I believe, is the wide release U.S. date. The official theatrical premiere, which happened at Radio City Music Hall in New York, was October 7th, 1971. So interestingly, the movie premiered just 6 days after Walt Disney World opened the same year. Yeah, the 50th anniversary technically happened last year in October, and they've sort of treated it as a year-plus long celebration because the pandemic, scuttled some of those plans.
Alrighty. Well, the origins of this, just in case folks don't know, it was the English author Mary Norton who published her first children's book, The Magic Bedknob, in 1943. Then in August of 1945, Variety reported that Walt Disney had purchased the film rights to the book. Then Norton published Bonfires and Broomsticks in 1947, and the two children's books were then combined into Bedknob and Broomsticks in 1957. My question for you is this. Were you familiar with the book, or was the movie the introduction for you?
Yeah, the movie was the introduction for me. I grew up on this film from a pretty early age. I have young parents. My mom had actually grown up on this movie as well. And so there was sort of a trilogy in my household of Mary Poppins, Pete's Dragon, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Those were the live action Disney movies we had on VHS. I grew up loving them. Later, when I was probably like middle school age, I sought out the books. And what I had was what you mentioned, the combined edition of the two. And so I read it for the first time in my teenage years. I read those a few times since then. Fairly different in many ways, in very interesting ways from the movie, but wonderfully written, really charming books if anyone wants to check them out. But what I find so interesting about them is that Mary Norton wrote the sequel essentially knowing that it had already been optioned to become a movie with Disney.
Very, very cool. Now, just for folks who don't know, because I must admit, I knew pretty much nothing about Bedknobs and Broomsticks. I knew the title, I knew select songs because I'm a Sherman Brothers fan. Other than that, I knew nothing. So for someone out there listening who knows nothing, can you give us kind of a brief synopsis of the story of the movie?
Sure. Well, let me take one step back, if I can, and sort of talk about the magic, the appeal of this movie, which I think leads into what it's about, which is like Mary Poppins, like Harry Potter, like Hocus Pocus even. This is a movie that supposes that magic is real, that it exists, in our real world that we as mortals experience in the 20th century. So compare that to something like Lord of the Rings, which is its own fictive realm where magic is part of like the natural order. Bedknobs and Broomsticks says, no, it's part of the world that we know, but it's sort of secret and hidden away. And I think that kind of story is very appealing. I think it speaks to this sort of innate desire that we all have to affirm the inner child, to acknowledge the supernatural, or this desire to believe in whether it's in our hopes and dreams, or it's in faith, or believe in ourselves even, which is a point that the movie ultimately makes. What Bedknobs and Broomsticks does is it takes that kind of story, a magic is real story, and it gives it incredibly high stakes, because what this movie is ultimately about is a woman learning to become a witch so that she can use magic to fight the Nazis in World War II, which I think is the most incredible single sentence summary of a movie ever. And I just can't imagine anyone hearing that and not wanting to run out and see this movie.
Okay, Aaron, I love you. I respect you. We're going to have very different opinions of this movie.
Okay.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that this is a good movie, or do you think that this is a super nostalgic experience for you?
Well, look, can anyone ever objectively fully answer?
I know, it's a hard question to answer. To be fair, I am the guy that is known as, I don't love Mary Poppins. Those Walt Disney 1970s live action films, they're not my cup of tea. There's a lot of them I haven't seen. I didn't grow up with them. I do feel like a lot of them are nostalgic for people, which is great. Listen, I love nostalgia. It's just not my nostalgia. I don't know. I had a hard time really getting into this.
Yeah. It's fair. And I think, you use the phrase cup of tea, and we should say, Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks are very much the same cup of tea. And a criticism frequently brought against this movie is that it's sort of the lesser than derivative, sort of like the ugly cousin of Mary Poppins, which I don't think is a fair criticism, but it's been out there since the movie's release. And certainly, the Walt Disney Studios hoped that this would be their quote unquote next Mary Poppins. And sort of the history here is that when Walt Disney was chasing down the book rights to Mary Poppins and he couldn't get them from P.L. Travers, he optioned the rights to Bedknobs and Broomsticks as a backup. And he told the Sherman brothers, I want you to go all in on these two projects, write the songs, and if we can't make Mary Poppins, we'll use the songs in Bedknobs and Broomsticks because the stories are sort of transferable. So that's the background there. So absolutely, Bedknobs and Broomsticks flowed out of Mary Poppins. It's essentially the same creative team. You've got the Sherman brothers writing the music. As you mentioned, you have the same director, most of the same folks behind the scenes. And then, of course, you have David Tomlinson, who plays Mr. Banks in Mary Poppins, as Amelius Brown in Bedknobs and Broomsticks. So the DNA is very much the same. And also, at the end of the day, this is an early 70s live-action fantasy film and a musical at that. So it has a certain pace. It's the same pace that we find in Mary Poppins, and that's just sort of a thing of the era. So I think it's fair to say that if one doesn't love Mary Poppins, one might not love this film either. But I will say, as impossible as it is for me to separate my own nostalgia or childhood love for this film from an objective reading of it today, I do think that I could sit down and write chapters and chapters of analysis of this movie, which I think says to me at least that there's a lot here. There's a lot of substance. There's a lot of thematic weight to the film, which tells me that there's something to it. But I am curious, Jeff, which version of the movie did you watch? Do you know?
I didn't realize there was more than one version. I watched what's on Disney Plus.
Okay, so very interesting, and I'll try to move through this quickly without getting too into the weeds. There are many versions of Bedknobs and Broomsticks. The film was originally conceived of or created as a 141-minute film. That's what was supposed to premiere at Radio City Music Hall, but the music hall had very strict rules about maximum runtime for a film. And so Disney conceded and agreed to trim off 23 minutes from the runtime. So it is the 118-minute version that premiered, that later went to theaters, and that's the version that for many, many years was on home video. Now, and I'll also mention that in 1979, when it was re-released at theaters, they trimmed off another 20 minutes down to 98.
Okay, wait, this is not a practice that should exist. Why does this exist? Movies are locked, please.
I agree, but the plot thickens. So in 1996, they decide for an upcoming anniversary of the film that they're going to go find all of the excised footage and restore it. But what they find is that most of it exists, but some of it has been completely lost and other parts are damaged beyond repair. So in 1996, they release a mostly restored version that brings it back to 139 minutes. That premiered at the Motion Picture of Art and Sciences Academy, later on Disney Channel in 1998, and then on VHS and DVD in 2001 and 2009. But then for whatever reason in 2014, when they brought it to Blu-ray, it was the abridged 118-minute version, and then that's what they've put on Disney+. And the great irony here is if you go to Disney+ and you click on bonus features for Bedknobs and Broomsticks, you will find a 25-minute featurette talking about why the abridged version doesn't work, and yet that's the only version that they make available on Disney+. So go figure. But Jeff, I will say what you're missing, even though it's the version that generations grew up with, right? So it's perfectly valid. But I think what you miss in the abridged version is the heart of the film, because that's sort of what I think the studio decided was extraneous and disposable. But sort of the whole emotional through line got pulled out. So if you do get a chance to watch the full version, you may or may not have a different response to it, even though it is ultimately much longer.
I was going to say, I don't think I would be more willing to go back and do that if they're like, okay, we will cut, what's that song called? The Square song or oh gosh, the huge dance number.
Portobello Road,
not Square. Sorry. Yeah. If they were like, we'll cut that by 3/4 and then we'll add in the heart, maybe I'd consider it, but I don't need a longer Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Okay. Here's what I can't wait to tell you, you having just said that. In the version you saw, Portobello Road, admittedly a long sequence, is about 3 minutes. In the full version, it is an 11-minute musical number.
Nope, done. Thank you very much. Done. Checking out.
It's glorious, Jeff. It is glorious.
I'm glad you enjoy it. As you know, you're saying there's a lot to this movie. There's also a lot of swastikas, I will say, and immediately yes. Up front, which was quite shocking. I was like, it's so interesting. I mean, obviously times have changed, right? But it's one of those things I can't believe hasn't been censored at this point. Not that I think it should. I don't agree with changing the history of movies and stuff. It's adding warnings and stuff at the beginning. I'm all for, but it was shocking, I must say. And before we move on, Walt Disney had very little to do with this, right? Because it was 5 years after his passing that it came out.
No, he was quite involved creatively with the film. I mean, beginning in the early 60s, at the time that Mary Poppins was in the works, before he even had the rights to Peel Travers, he was involved creatively. So a lot of what we see, even like the storyboards and everything, the script notes came out of sessions with Walt.
So it was on the shelf for a very, very long time.
That's right, yeah.
Interesting. Alrighty. But so yeah, these opening credits, I don't know, man. It was just like immediately unappealing to me.
Yeah, the opening credits are interesting. So it's this sort of, it looks like a hand-drawn map of sort of this very medieval depiction of sorcery, and even there are astrological symbols and things in there. That is a play on a World War II era, I think, New Yorker magazine cover that was itself a play on a very famous tapestry that's like a well-known work of art in England. It was sort of used to depict the history of war. What I find interesting about it is that very early on, the movie is cueing its audience into the fact that this is going to be a war film. And what I love about that is just that it's bold. I always admire anything, particularly at Disney, that respects a young audience and their ability to handle big, dark, mature themes. And so, yeah, to have a witch fighting Nazis, it's just so unexpected. And that's part of what, even as a kid, sort of made me sit up and pay attention and just really held my fascination.
And now we can't even have scary villains. My, things have changed, haven't they?
It's true. But I will say, so this movie, and to my knowledge, it's the only movie, at least that I've come across, that considers this very significant chapter of World War II history that doesn't get talked about as much, which is where, massive numbers of children who lived in the London area were taken away from their families and shipped off into more rural parts of the English countryside to live with complete strangers in many cases to get them away from the bombings. And I don't know that I've ever seen another movie or work of art to consider not only the history of that, but the psychological impact on those children, which is one of the emotional threads that is running throughout this story and is really explored in greater depth in that unabridged version.
What I found interesting was when I think of Angela Lansbury and Disney, my first thought is Mrs. Potts. I'm curious what yours is. Is it Miss Price or Mrs. Potts? If I were to just say Angela Lansbury, Disney, first thought in your head, which one does it go to?
Yeah, Bedknobs and Broomsticks for sure. I mean, it's a much bigger part, right?
Okay, not to me, but yes, time-wise.
In terms of screen time,
yes,
I mean.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what I find so interesting is like, she's kind of I don't want to say like a hard character, but she's not lovable. And I always think of Angela Lansbury as like this lovable grandmotherly figure, just because Mrs. Potts, even though, obviously Murder, She Wrote and tons of other stuff, Mame even, I just always go to Mrs. Potts first. So it was interesting to see her play this character that like didn't really like children very much, didn't want to take them, felt obligated to.
Yeah. Okay. So there's so much that we can talk about with that. I mean, yeah, she's sort of a stern cross character in the way that P.L. Travers's Mary Poppins is, right? Whereas Julie Andrews played a slightly sweeter version of that character. One thing that is often talked about is that even though Bedknobs and Broomsticks is an American film, it's very, very British. And I recently heard a podcast called Once Upon a Scream. It's like a Disney meets horror podcast that I quite enjoy. But it's some British gentlemen who host that show, and they were saying that even as British people, they watch it and forget that it's an American film up until they start referring to soccer as football or vice versa. So I do think that there's that sort of sensibility of like this hard-edged, no-nonsense, slightly harsher approach to life, or harsh is maybe not the word, but more fatalistic that you get with traditional English children's literature that I think is honored in this film. And then as to her not wanting children, in academia, a surprising amount has been written about this movie and the way that Eglantine Price is coded as a lesbian. And there's a lot that's been written about sort of a queer reading of this film. There's certainly a lot of camp involved in it, but she is ultimately a character who is sort of like prim and buttoned down and not especially feminine, who lives in secrecy and away from society and has no interest in gentlemen suitors or in having children. And there's a lot of discussion about those things in the movie. So anyway, if anyone wants to kind of pursue that line of thought, there's a lot of interesting discussion of that in the academic literature.
Huh. I will say that this film reminded me more, clearly there are the Mary Poppins ties, but it actually reminded me more of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. It had that vibe more so for me.
Yeah, well, certainly the flying bed, I think, like when I see those sequences, you kind of, the flying car comes to mind.
Yeah, and of course the Sherman Brothers did the music for both. And so one of the things that I think is, obviously super iconic Disney is Sherman Brothers music. And I couldn't help but notice my favorite Disney song is very much in this film, even though it's not. There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow from the Carousel of Progress is like the whole flying sequence score.
Okay, it's interesting that you say that. I'll have to re-listen to that piece of music with the Carousel of Progress in mind, but the piece that you're referring to is actually a deleted song called A Step in the Right Direction, which appears in part in the restored version, but that's some of the lost footage. But if you get the Bedknobs and Broomsticks CD soundtrack that was released in 1996, you can hear the complete recording of that song with Angela Lansbury singing it. It's a Sherman Brothers song called A Step in the Right Direction. Wonderful Sherman lyrics in that song.
But wait a second. I can't believe you've never recognized this as being the same song, because like literally it started, I was like, this is Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow. Like this is a blatant ripoff of themselves. You didn't hear that?
Well, again, because I know the song that like the actual song that piece of score is hearkening back to. I don't know that I've ever heard it as anything other than the song that it is, but I will go back and listen to it.
Yeah, it's when she's flying for the first time. You hear it on her broomstick. And I was just like, wow, this is crazy. Speaking of the music, though, I mean, I will say my favorite thing about this movie, and it's something that I knew before seeing it, is The Age of Not Believing. Mm-hmm. This is a tremendous song. This is one of my favorite Sherman Brothers songs. I love this song about, hitting that age where you stop believing in magic and make-believe and stuff. And one of the characters, I believe he's 11 years old, right?
Yeah.
And, he's hit that age of not believing. It's a beautiful melody. It's beautiful lyrics. I love this song. And it's my favorite part of the movie.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's a beautiful song. I think that whole notion of the age of not believing is a pretty universal experience, like particularly for those of us who maybe grew up as Disney fans and sort of returned to the fandom as adults. Many of us went through that period, some to a greater extent than others, myself less so. But of being a teenager inside, sort of withdrawing from all of that. And so it does speak to this like universal human experience. I also think that's a song that the Disney company has really underutilized. Just sort of its core lyrical message just gets at the heart of what the whole brand is about. And so, I don't know why it doesn't feature in fireworks shows or, used more widely in the parks, for example. But I think maybe one reason might be that the core, like the end conclusion of that song or its thesis is not sort of, well, you should just go back to believing what you did in childhood. It kind of takes you on a journey and says, well, your sense of belief needs to mature into something other than what it was. And I think that's like this very, I don't know if British is the right word, but this sort of less sugary approach to the notion of, faith and magic and belief.
I don't want to jump ahead here. Can you remind me when we get to the stage musical about this song? Because I have a question.
Okay.
That I feel like we'll get to it. I don't want to jump ahead. But yes, I hear what you're saying there. I feel like that happens quite a bit. But I do feel like sometimes, and I can't think of a specific example, it's like if you actually listen to the message, it's not a great message. I always felt this with High School Musical, stick to the status quo. I'm like, that is a horrible message to send to children. This is a song that should have a reprise that like gives the opposite message, yet it doesn't exist. I've always felt that way. Stick to what you know. Stick to satire, the status quo. What?
Like in the movie, in High School Musical, that song is satire, right? I mean, like the people singing that song is like the society.
Yes, agreed. But I just feel like it's a weird message.
Yeah.
I don't know. It always stuck out to me, and I actually liked the song, but I'm like, these are just not lyrics like the kids should be singing, I feel like. But yes, you're right. It is done in a satirical way.
When we get our full-fledged, like true Broadway production of High School Musical, maybe we'll get a reprise that addresses that.
Perhaps. I don't know. If I'm in charge, we will. Anyway, some other things that just kind of stuck out to me was like the Psychedelic Bed Flight. This was so 70s, so go get high and watch this movie sort of stuff.
Yeah. And if you read the book, which of course came before the movie, right? You read the description of what the bed looks like while it flies. It's so impressive to me to see like how a 1970s film studio adapted the text on the page to something so visual in a way that really honored the description of it. I think I can read to you an excerpt from the first time it's described. She writes, "The bed gave a sickening lurch. The night seemed to turn blue, a blue that glittered like a flying tinsel ribbon, a rushing, shimmering blue, turning to gold, to light, to heat, dashed to blinding sunshine." Later, she talks about it. Reality changes into different colors, a pale light deepening to gold and a rose and a blue and then a yellow. So that very much comes from the description on the page, but in a way that I think was state of the art in the 1970s and is very sort of charming and nostalgic today.
I think that one of the best things about the film are the effects. I think the effects are great. Obviously, for the most part, they're practical effects or, some camera trickery, but like really well done effects in the film overall for a film in the 1970s, stuff that would have 100% just been done in a computer today. But I thought it was really good. I mean, we can keep comparing this to Mary Poppins. Due to that fact, there's this whole sequence that takes place in an animation world. And I will say some of the matching of the animated characters interacting with the live action characters, I think is spectacular.
Yeah, and when the movie was released, I mean, reviews were mixed. I mean, they ranged from negative to quite positive and everywhere in between. But the one sort where there were two through lines or consensus points in those reviews. One was that Angela Lansbury's performance is wonderful, and the other is that the special effects were at that time some of the best that the studio had ever produced.
Yeah, I would not disagree with that. I think that's great. Another moment that I love is just the chant of Triguna Macoitus Tricorum Satis D. I'm like, okay, Angela Lansbury 100% could have been a Disney villain, the voice of a Disney villain, because she has such like evil queen vibes in her voice when she reads that I loved it. I was like, ooh.
Yeah. A couple of points on that. I mean, the movie does have these like tinges of this like implication of the sinister or the ominous. They're very effective. It's not a scary movie. Sometimes Disney puts it forward as a Halloween movie. It's not quite that, but it does have these moments. And while ultimately we come to love and to champion Eglantine, her first appearance on screen, she's coded as a villain. If you recall, it's when she's riding up on her motorbike. She's dressed in purple and blue, and she has this green sulfur smoke coming out of her motorbike behind her, so she looks like a witch, like a villain. And for a while, we aren't sure about her, whether she's good or bad, right? And so there is that kind of tinge to her voice, as you mentioned. The counter melody of those spell words, Triguna, Macoites, Tricorum, Satis D, the way that those are utilized in the song Substitutionary Locomotion, I think this is such a fun fact. That was Walt Disney's idea. So the Sherman Brothers, when they wrote that song, it didn't include the counter melody with chanting those lyrics. They played the song for Walt. He loved it, but he suggested, I think you should take those spell words and write them into the song as a counter melody, which, like, who knew that Walt Disney was that much of a songwriter to even be able to suggest that? And it totally makes the song.
That's awesome. That is that should have been your trivia question for me. That was a really good little factoid there. I like that. Another thing I love is, so these empty soldiers, the armor that marches with like no bodies is so cool. And all I thought was, I hope, and if it hasn't been, it should be in the future. This needs to be in a Disney Parks parade. These like bodiless bodies of armor marching down the street were cool.
Yeah. Oh, I get chills thinking about that. I'd never thought about like that specifically being in a parade, but that would be amazing. Hopefully it'll happen.
Let's talk for a moment about this movie represented in the parks, because the thing I know of is, I believe Main Street Electrical Parade at one point had some of the animated characters in the parade, correct?
Yes. So at different points during the history of the Main Street Electrical Parade, there have been two different Bedknobs sort of sequences. There was one very short-lived Beautiful Briny Sea sequence that ran in both Disneyland and Magic Kingdom from 1977 to 78. Then that float was repurposed as an extended portion of the Pinocchio sequence. The other longer-lasting tribute to Bedknobs and Broomsticks in that parade is that King Leonidas, who's the Lion King on the island of Naboo, he was part of the Dumbo circus sequence for a very long time. In fact, in Disneyland, he was there from 72 to 96, in Magic Kingdom from 77 to 2001, in Tokyo 85 to 95, Paris 92 to 2003, and at California Adventure 2001 to 2009. So for a big chunk of this parade's history, this character from Bedknobs and Broomsticks was part of the Main Street Electrical Parade. And they still trot him out from time to time for isolated events. For example, D23 did a screening of this movie at Disney Springs a number of years back, and they had a surprise meet and greet with King Leonidas there.
I'm just realizing the only thing that could make like the Main Street Electrical Parade better for you is if there was a Mary Poppins sequence, because it had Bedknobs and Broomsticks, it had Pete's Dragon. I know. Was there ever a Mary Poppins? I don't think so, right?
I don't think so. I mean, she's in Spectra Magic, so if we could just combine those two.
There we go. Yeah, are there any other nods in the parks that you know of? I have a feeling there's probably some store window nods, or that, Triguna Macoitis probably pops up in a spell book or around Halloween or something. Do you know of any?
Well, I'll tell you two unofficial ones. First, as a kid, the restaurant that used to be at Downtown Disney, the Portobello Yacht Club, has nothing to do with the movie, but as a kid, I believed that it did and demanded that my parents take me there. And I was very disappointed to see zero references to the movie inside. Also, just very recently, the United Kingdom Pavilion started selling a fish and chips t-shirt. Not sure if they still do, but there was a fish design on it who looks almost identical to Mr. Codfish in the Beautiful Briny Sea, but dressed differently. So that's sort of an unofficial nod. The only other official parks representation that I can think of or am aware of is that the Walt Disney World Band will sometimes perform the Old Home Guard, which is like the most random deep cut song from this movie that they could perform, but it has sort of an army march sensibility to it. And so you'll sometimes hear that on Main Street. And in fact, it is included on the Walt Disney World Band's album from I think the early 2000s.
Oh, okay, so if I had to, if you had to choose between this film and Mary Poppins, do you have a preference?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mary Poppins is the better film. I will say that if Bedknobs had been released to the world as intended, which is not only the full version that was filmed, but also this musical piece that was written and storyboarded for the film, but never actually recorded or shot, which is a song that the children would have sing at the beginning called Nobody's Problems. Later, Angela Lansbury's character reprises that. The reprise is included in the restored version, but not the original. I think if we'd gotten all of that with the emotional through line that was intended, I think it would be very close to being as strong and effective as Mary Poppins. But even with the version of the movie that we ended up getting, if Mary Poppins is a 4.5, to my mind, Bedknobs and Broomsticks, or I'm sorry, if Mary Poppins is a 5-star, Bedknobs and Broomsticks is like a 4.8.
Okay. Now, at the end of this film, when the characters are saying their goodbyes and such, we do have this moment where the little boy pulls out the bed knob and he says, "I still have this." So was there intended to be a sequel to this that you know of?
Yeah, I've never heard whether there was an intention for a sequel, but that very shot that you're talking about has the exact same energy as in Hocus Pocus when the spell book opens its eye at the very end. It's that playful tease of like the magic is still here and more adventures are to come. And hey, we're getting a Hocus Pocus sequel after all these years. So
took 30 years. It's taken a little longer for Bedknobs and Broomsticks. But I was actually going to ask you, considering your knowledge and love of Hocus Pocus, are there any ties in Hocus Pocus that are nods to Bedknobs and Broomsticks? Because I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know of any or didn't recognize any.
Yeah, I don't know that there's anything explicitly. I mean, in writing about Hocus Pocus, I have written about Bedknobs and Broomsticks and some of the like thematic overlap between the two. And I think certainly there's a very interesting study to be had on the lineage of witchcraft in Disney films. And those are like both part of that narrative. But no, I don't think there are any explicit nods.
Alrighty. Well, I want to move on to your experience at the Walt Disney Studios for the 50th anniversary screening. But is there anything specifically about the movie that you want to talk about before we move on?
Well, I think just one other thing I would say is that in terms of this movie's legacy and its enduring popularity, I mean, what I have found is that as sort of like the lesser known cousin or successor of Mary Poppins, it is nevertheless a more widely known movie than I might have realized growing up. And I have found this to be true just in, studying Disney and getting to know so many folks, that it is a fairly widely beloved and known and appreciated film. A lot of folks from multiple generations have grown up with it. And I think we see that reflected in the current 50th anniversary celebration, which has way more pomp and circumstance than I ever would have expected the company to give it. It's had a real sense of occasion. I mean, going on for over a year now, there's just been one thing after another: exclusive merchandise, the screening that we're about to talk about, the stage musical premiering, articles on the website. They did a whole issue of D23 magazine about it. So I think all of that speaks to real sort of desire and appetite in the fan base beyond even like the hardcore Disney fan base, maybe even in the general public for this movie, which might mean that there is more to come in the future, whether it's a sequel, a remake, a transfer of the stage musical, which we'll talk about, to Broadway and so on.
Now that you talk about sequels and such, I was just thinking about Mary Poppins Returns has that whole underwater sequence that's a bit reminiscent of Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Interesting discussion to be had there. The song The Beautiful Briny Sea was written for Mary Poppins. And the scene that it was going to be utilized for in Mary Poppins came from the Travers books. That same scene inspired the scene you're talking about in Mary Poppins Returns. So there's kind of like this trilogy connection between the two Mary Poppins movies and Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
I am curious with the book, was there talk of the kids entering an animated world, or was that a Disney choice?
No, not animated. The book is different in a number of ways. They go to an island that turns out to be an island of cannibals, and there's some sort of uncomfortable race things happening in the book. With that scene, I think Disney probably saw that and wisely changed it to the island of Nabumbu that we have in the film.
Alrighty. So, the Walt Disney Studios decided to have a 50th anniversary screening of this movie that you had been keeping your eyes on for a very long time. You had been tweeting about it because I guess they announced it, but then kind of removed a date, then gave a season, then the season passed, and you were just consistently tweeting about this. And I gotta say, obviously, one of my favorite things is to talk to people about things they're passionate about. And I knew that you were passionate about this, but I genuinely thought you were just excited that this was being done. I did not realize that when it finally happened, you were going to fly across the country to experience Bedknobs and Broomsticks at the Walt Disney Studios. Very sadly for me, selfishly, is you came on the first week of 2022 that I was not in California. 10-minute walk from the studio. I would have loved to. I would have absolutely positively gone to this with you if the timing worked out. But it was literally the first time I was leaving the state for the year, and man, the timing did not work out. But I'm glad you got to do it.
Yeah, I did hate that because I truly feel that a trip to California is not complete without time spent with Jeff DePaoli. So that was a bummer. But I knew deep down, even before I had consciously made the decision, I think I knew deep down that the moment the dates are announced for this, I'm booking a flight. And of course, that's exactly what I did. You're right. I had been relentlessly not only tweeting, calling, emailing D23 because they kept saying it's going to be in March, and then we were well into March and nothing had been announced, and it finally got pushed back to April rather. But yeah, I immediately took a flight out there, and I'm so glad that I did. So I can tell you a little bit about what this was. It was a 50th anniversary fan event screening. It was a hard ticketed event made available exclusively to D23 Gold members, and it was a screening of the movie at the Walt Disney Studios, which, as your listeners may know, is not generally open to the public. So you can't get onto those studio grounds, unless you work there or you are invited to participate in an event like this. And there were 2 back-to-back screenings, so you could have either a morning slot or an afternoon slot. I had the morning slot. My morning time there appeared to be sold out. I don't know if that was true for the afternoon as well. But so they screened the movie. Unfortunately, it was the abridged version that appears on Disney Plus. That surprised me. At an event that's catering to a hardcore fan base for this film, you'd think they do the long one. But anyway, preceding the screening itself was a nice sort of retrospective little featurette that they played, and they had some folks up there to talk to us about the history of the movie. And what's really cool is that even though it's set in England, almost all of it was filmed on the Disney studio lot. And so before playing the movie, they would pull up individual scenes and say, this shot that you see here was filmed in those trees right around the corner outside this building, and this shot was filmed in soundstage 3 at the end of the street. So it was very cool to be right there where it happened, and that clearly colored the viewing of the film, which was in many ways revelatory for me. It was a packed house in a movie theater there on the studio lot, and it just caused me to experience the movie in a way I never had before. I'd never thought of it as a comedy, and what I realized is that everyone, myself included, were laughing heartily aloud throughout the whole movie, and now I've rewatched it twice since then. And I find myself really appreciating the comedic parts of the film because there's some really funny lines and line deliveries by the children, who, by the way, are great child actors. And so I really appreciate any time that something I've known for so many years can be given new meaning or new perspective. And this screening certainly did that for me.
I love that you said that because it is true. There is something very different about a communal experience in a theater, seeing something where even something you've seen a million times, you realize in that moment, you're oh, this is funny, or oh, this is scary, or oh, whatever that communal experiences that really brings that. I've had that happen. I can't think of specific films, but one thing I do remember is the first time I saw Honey, I Shrunk the Kids on the big screen was only about somewhere between 5 and 8 years ago. And I was watching that, noticing things I'd never noticed before. And this is a movie I've seen a billion times, and I think that's great. And I think that's a great reason why movies should go to the big screen and not just stream on Disney Plus or Netflix or whatever. I think every movie deserves a big screen release in some way. But yeah, I think that's great to hear. Curious, did they show you a digital projection of it, or was it actual film print? Do you know?
I don't know. And I didn't think to inquire. My guess would be digital.
Yeah, probably.
Particularly given that it was, it appeared to be a very cleanly restored print of the current abridged version. So that would lead me to believe it was digital.
I mean, I'm lucky enough to have spent a lot of time on that lot. I'm curious to hear what your first experience was like, but also I think folks would love to hear, in case they ever consider going to a D23 event like this in the future, what kind of access you had. Because obviously, it is a studio lot. Yes, it's the weekend. Most people aren't at work at the time, but it is a studio lot. There's security around. I assume don't have free reign of the place and get yourself into trouble like I have. But what kind of access did you have?
Yeah, great question. And I have a few things to share on that. So after the movie ended, we were told we had about an hour. In reality, it was like over an hour and a half to do as many of the following 4 things as we wanted to do or could do. First, there were 2 shopping experiences available. There's the studio store, which is essentially like a Disney store you used to find in the mall, but with also some studio exclusive merchandise. There was an employee store that typically can only be, is only available to folks who work at the studio specifically or who are there as that employee's guest. But this was open to anyone with a ticket to this event, but in limited numbers because it's a very small space. And so it was like first come, first serve, and people ran to get in that line. I didn't bother with that because I've been in those Disney employee stores in other locations in the past. And I just felt like, been there, done that. I'm not a big merch collector anyway. I did go to the studio store. And then the other experiences where there was an archives exhibit, which had the actual storybook that Paul has, the story of Nabumbu, that was on display. Those suits of armor that you were so taken by, Jeff, those were there, as well as a lot of behind the scenes photos that I had never seen before of the special effects being created through the studio's famous sodium vapor process, which was sort of a predecessor of the green screen that we know today. So I learned a lot through that exhibit. That was wonderful to walk through and see. And then the last thing that we could do is sort of roam the studio grounds. Now, there was a section of the studio that was open to us, right? So there were definitely like perimeter access points you couldn't go beyond. But it was a fairly large chunk of land that we got to walk around, and we didn't have handlers. We didn't have chaperones. And so I did feel that I had some sort of like free roaming autonomy to explore. And it was a very emotional experience for me. I mean, I'm standing in like the place that I saw in The Reluctant Dragon. I mean, the place that we have seen so many archival photos of, Walt and the Sherman brothers walking around, and to look at these buildings and to think, Walt Disney had these buildings built in the 1930s and 40s using the money that he made from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and to walk by the animation building and think about everything that came out of that. The multiplane camera, like the original multiplane camera, is there on display. I walked right up to it. So all of that was just like surreal, almost like an out of body experience. Of course, there's the famous Dopey Drive sign. We got to walk up there, lean up against it, take our photo with it. And all of this was allowed. Now, I will say there was a little bit of discussion between the various Disney cast members operating the event as to how much free rein we should be given. And I heard a little bit of disagreement. Like there were some guards who were very sort of strict, and then other folks from either D23 or the studio walked over like, hey, it's okay. You can relax. They're okay to walk around. So maybe it's a little bit of your mileage may vary depending on who's staffing the event that day. But it was far less regimented than I might have anticipated a limited access Disney studio event to be.
Yeah, that sounds freer than some of the ones I've seen in the past. So I'm happy you got to have that experience. But I must ask, considering you're the biggest Disney Legends ceremony fan I know of, did you get to go to Legends Plaza?
Oh gosh, so we could walk up to it, and I can't tell you how badly I wanted to walk through it, but they did have someone there very nicely telling us that at least on this day, I forget why, but for some reason they couldn't allow people into that plaza. So I could see the plaques, but I just couldn't walk all the way up to them. But that was still very cool. And I will say, I have had in my life a few opportunities to go to the studios for various events. I was once invited there for like a whole press thing to do a story on the archives, and it just never worked out. I live on the other side of the country, and I was never able to get there. So it felt like a long time coming, being there. And I would just say to any Disney fan, if there's ever an event like this in the future, and even if it's for a movie you don't particularly know or care for, like take the opportunity to go to the studio grounds, because it's not an everyday kind of opportunity, and it's really special.
I would say more so than a screening, do one of the tours, especially one that goes to Walt's office, because those are really good. If you're like a big studio lot fan. I will say the funny thing about the Disney Studios is, like, of all the studio lots I've been to, it's always the quietest. Like, even on a work day, it's just a very quiet lot. It's funny now that you've been there. I bet you start seeing it pop up in TV shows and stuff. Like, I can remember watching shows and be like, oh, that's a high school from such and such. You know, they do, because they have a very specific color and a very specific look, and you'll just see them pop up. What was I watching? I was watching Michael J. Fox's first movie, Midnight Madness, from like the early 80s. And if I'm remembering correctly, the studio lot popped up in that. And I was like, oh yeah, look at that. That's the Walt Disney Studios. So it's funny.
It's so funny you mentioned that, because I got back home from that trip, and the very next day I watched the finale episode of Blackish, like the series finale. Mm-hmm. And at the very end, they walk out of it's either a high school or a college campus building. And I'm like, yep, that's the very building I stood in front of at the studio lot. Instantly recognizable. And yeah, in terms of it being quiet, you're absolutely right. It was very, very quiet all around the studio. And that's part of what was so wonderful about it. It's a beautiful campus. You know, it's obviously had a lot of time to grow, the trees and the shrubbery and everything. And at one point we just sat on the Gary Marshall bench. Many of the benches there have the names of various people who've been important to the studio. That was very meaningful to me. Of course, Gary Marshall, his work in Hocus Pocus. Just got to kind of lounge and just take in the scenery. And that was really special as well. Also got to walk up to Soundstage 2, which is where both Mary Poppins and Hocus Pocus were filmed. So even though I didn't get to go inside the building, it was very cool to stand outside and just sort of think about the history of Julie Andrews and David Tomlinson walking through those doors, as well as, you know, Bette Midler and everyone else from Hocus Pocus.
Very cool. Now let's move on, because as I said, you flew to Europe to see the new stage production of Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And this is something, correct me if I'm wrong, this was supposed to premiere in Chicago, wasn't it? I remember press releases coming out about this for the Chicago Shakespeare's 2018-2019 season. And this never happened, right?
That's right. Yeah. So this was a story I was following very closely, because it's another one of those things where the minute tickets went on sale, I was going to book a flight to Chicago and go. And yeah, it was supposed to premiere May 30th, 2019. And not too long before that. I mean, I think like a week before tickets went on sale, if I recall, the director and choreographer of the Chicago production died unexpectedly. So very, very sad, very tragic. And I think it was just so close to the opening that, you know, for one reason or another, they made the decision to just shut down the production. And they said at the time, we will include this in our next season. Stay tuned. So of course I signed up for their emails, but then the next season came, nothing happened. And then it was the pandemic. And so there was just this big question mark hovering, at least in my mind. I don't know how many people were really talking about it. It wasn't being written about, but, you know, hey, what's happening with the Bedknobs musical? And then interestingly, the next time that we heard any news about it was, do you happen to know when it was? I find this very fascinating.
I don't know, no.
Okay, so it was during the pandemic when Schumacher was announcing the news of Frozen closing for good and not coming back. Remember, that was like this bombshell announcement that took everyone by surprise. And it was in that same, I don't know if it was like a press conference or an interview or what it was, but it was in that same announcement that he sort of mentioned offhandedly, oh, by the way, that Bedknobs musical is happening, and it's going to be now not in Chicago, but in the United Kingdom as a touring production.
Now that's interesting to me, because the official title for this production that is on tour in the UK and Ireland, it says Michael Harrison Presents Disney Bedknobs and Broomsticks, the Magical Musical, which is very different from the way that they phrased the Mary Poppins title, which is Disney and Cameron Mackintosh Present Mary Poppins. So, I mean, Disney is not Michael Harrison Presents. It doesn't say Disney and Michael Harrison Present. So, like, this is not a Disney theatrical production.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Strictly speaking, it is not. But I think a useful point of comparison is the Sister Act musical, which is a case where Disney just straight up licensed Sister Act to the producers of that musical and were otherwise not involved, right? So that is in no way a Disney theatrical production, even though Alan Menken coincidentally wrote the music for Sister Act on stage. But this situation is different. So it's not officially Disney Theatrical, but the official verbiage here is produced by Michael Harrison by special arrangement with Disney Theatrical Productions. Now, that's sort of an ambiguous statement, special arrangement with. The question that immediately comes to my mind is, how much does that mean? The rumor here is that Disney Theatrical is very, very involved, sort of quietly and behind the scenes, in the creative development of this musical, possibly with an eye toward doing something bigger with it in the future. There is a lot of talk about it transferring to West End. By the way, when I saw it in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which I flew to Europe specifically to see this show. And that was its final week of the UK tour. So that's now closed or closing as we record this. But there's a lot of talk and even some actual media reports of plans in the works for a West End transfer. Hopefully that will happen. I think from there, who knows what we might see. I think a Broadway transfer is not out of the realm of possibility, or perhaps a U.S. tour, or perhaps a limited runs staging at like La Jolla or Paper Mill Playhouse or something like that. But it's been a very well-received production. I think in terms of ticket sales, as I understand, it's been quite successful. When I saw it, it was a sold-out night in Belfast, and I think there's real appetite for it. And clearly, Disney sees potential if they were involved beyond merely licensing it. And it's very much the Disney movie, not so much the books that have been adapted to stage.
So we both have problems because I flew to London for a flying car and you flew to Ireland for a flying bed. We are privileged jerks and fools.
You're so right.
Oh, man. So I will say, as much as I'm not a huge fan of the Mary Poppins movie, I love the stage musical. Mm-hmm. So I'd be very curious to see if the same went with Bedknobs and Broomsticks. Did it live up to everything you were hoping for? Was it more? Was it less? How was
gosh,
it?
Yes, lived up to and exceeded. I was just bowled over. I was in tears for much of the show. It's so well done, Jeff. I mean, if people come to a Disney musical on stage wanting to see sort of like Disney magic brought to life, which I think is very much what you get with Mary Poppins, this is that. It's such a great showcase of Disney magic. Now, the budget is not quite what it is for Mary Poppins and what I imagine it would be for this if it transfers to West End, right? Because this was conceived as a touring production through the UK, a lot of smaller houses, that sort of thing. But it's a real combination of magical special effects that are as grand as what we get in Mary Poppins. I hope it's not a spoiler to say that things fly, people fly, and it's all very convincing. And even if you can sort of in your mind imagine how it's working, the mechanics of it all are never visible to the naked eye. So it's really stage magic at work. And then there are other effects that are done with a little bit more breaking of the fourth wall, a little bit more like sort of like puppetry on stage in a way that's very, very artful and tasteful, but that I imagine would probably be spruced up with a bigger budget on West End or on Broadway. But beyond the special effects, first of all, those songs I mentioned earlier that got cut out of the movie, they're all back. They're in the way that the Sherman Brothers intended them. They give the story rather, the dramatic and emotional weight that it deserves. There are new songs that I think are worthy of the original Sherman songbook. But I don't want to give anything away because I want everyone to have the chance to hopefully someday experience this for themselves. But what this show does with the Bedknobs story is so much more innovative and more thoughtful and more of a change in direction from the movie than I would have anticipated. And it's just so clear that it's like somebody took 50 years to sit back and think about what else could we do with this story to make it even more impactful? And it just totally blew me away. I mean, my jaw dropped, but I know this story very well. And I thought, oh my God, I can't believe someone thought of this sort of new take on the story. And it's just incredibly effective.
I've always wanted, this is going so off topic, but I've always wanted to see or to put together a stage production of Psycho with a different twist ending. And that's what it sounds like happened for you.
Yeah, very much so. It is a different ending, a different direction. And it all sort of hinges, and again, I don't want to give anything away, but it hinges on the song you wanted us to talk about here, Jeff, which is The Age of Not Believing. And that song just takes on totally new and deeper meaning in the stage show.
Yeah, so the thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm happy to hear that the song took on new meaning here, is because, like I was saying with Stick to the Status Quo in High School Musical, I feel like there should be a reprise of The Age of Not Believing, giving the opposite message of what the original song does. So is that what goes on here in the musical, or is it something even more?
Not exactly. I mean, I think it's sort of the idea that you're hitting at is in the same sort of universe is what happens, but it's very impactful and unexpected. And it's just so thoughtful what happens. But again, I don't want to give it away because I do think there's a very good chance of a wider audience having access to this show in the near future. And by the way, we talked to the sound engineers there about the possibility of a cast recording, and they sort of gave us a wink and a nod that that's potentially in the works and that there's been a lot of demand for it. So I think people will have a chance to see more of this. And here's what I really believe could happen. Just like the Newsies Broadway musical sort of redeemed and elevated Newsies the movie and gave it what I think is like a permanent legacy now. Not that Bedknobs and Broomsticks the movie needs redeeming per se, but I think we'll see the same kind of effect. I think that this musical has the chance to be a real commercial mainstream success because it is this lavish Disney magic on stage kind of production with very enjoyable, appealing songs. And I think it'll make the whole world sort of remember and re-embrace Bedknobs and Broomsticks for a long time to come.
One thing I loved about the Mary Poppins musical is how all of the new music sounded like something that came from the original film. I loved that so much. That is a difficult task. And, you know, of course they used the Sherman Brothers tunes, but there was a lot of new music not written by the Sherman Brothers that felt so in the Sherman universe. I'm curious, does it translate the same way in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, or is it like, oh, that was a song that was clearly written by different people?
No, it's very much what you said with Mary Poppins. And they've very cleverly with some of the new songs, they went back to songs that the Sherman Brothers wrote that were thrown out early in the planning process for the movie. So they were never recorded or anything, but they went and sort of found ways to capitalize on those old lyrics and reincorporate them into new songs. There's also a new number called Negotiality, which has a very Sherman kind of ring to it, almost a little too on the nose because it's clearly getting at Fortuosity, which is a song from The Happiest Millionaire. But yeah, to answer your question, it's very much that all of the new songs have that Sherman DNA.
Okay. Very important question. Does the bed fly over the audience?
Okay. Hopefully this won't be perceived as a spoiler for anyone. The answer is no, it does not. It does.
If it goes to Broadway, it will.
But yeah, I think I had the same thought. In fact, I made that comment walking out. It was totally fine with me that it didn't fly over the audience, but I fully expect that if it goes to West End or Broadway, it will.
Okay, cool. The one iconic thing from the film that you kind of touched upon earlier was when we meet Angela Lansbury's character. She comes out on like this motorbike with this bright yellow smoke coming out of the back. Was that incorporated into the musical? It's such a tiny detail, but it was something that like caught my attention when I was watching the film.
Yeah, some very cool things happen with her motorbike in the stage musical.
Does it fly?
I don't think the motorbike flies, but a lot of things fly in this, Jeff. A lot of very cool things happen. And by the way, I had the opportunity. So I went to London right after Belfast, and I got to see Mary Poppins on West End. Now I had seen Mary Poppins previously on tour, but not in over a decade. And so it was a nice reminder of just how grand and lavish the special effects in Mary Poppins are. And while I do see a difference, obviously going from a regional production a touring production to a West End production, I think that even what I saw in Belfast with Bedknobs and Broomsticks was very much worthy of Mary Poppins. So if you appreciate the kind of magic on stage that happens there, I think you would also be happy with what you see in Bedknobs.
And frankly, if you don't believe in the magic on stage, you're just at that age of not believing, right?
That's right.
See what I did there? Anywho, the other thing I want to know about is in the film, there's a lot of turning people into rabbits. I'm curious how they handle this on stage.
Okay, so they do it through some very impressive costume change meets puppetry is the best way that I can describe it. But it works really well. It's a fun moment. The audience was very into it. One more thing I want to say about the audience reaction is that the crowd was so into this story. And in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, there's just a little bit of an undercurrent of romance between Eglantine Price and Emilius Brown. It's never explored in too much depth in the movie. You get a little bit more of it in the full unabridged version of the story. But the stage musical gives it some sort of space to breathe, and it's just so much more captivating. And there's a moment in the movie where, Emilius Brown is sort of invited to stay with the family and ultimately decides not to. And when that same moment happens in a somewhat different way in the stage musical, Jeff, the whole audience gasped, men, women, children, gasped, but with a disappointed sigh. And I just had this moment of, oh, this story has hooked this crowd, for them to have that kind of reaction. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's a really engaging approach to this story.
I would really like to see this in a theater that this is a spoiled brat thing, but I'm really into shows living in a theater. Tours are just not, it's different. And listen, if tour is the only access you have to theater, you should absolutely go. I go to tours all the time. But more and more, I'm just seeing the difference between a show that is built for a space versus a show that is built for the road. So I would love for this show, for my first experience seeing it, I would love for it to be in a space that it's built for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this show deserves that. And again, I'm very hopeful that it will get it. A cool little just fun fact about where I saw it. So I saw it at the Grand Opera House in Belfast, Northern Ireland. What's cool about that is that Angela Lansbury's grandfather in real life was the director of that very theater. And it was his line of employment in that theater that led his daughter, Angela Lansbury's mother, to become an actress. And that, of course, then led to Angela Lansbury becoming an actress and a singer. And so that whole through line that eventually brought her to Bedknobs and Broomsticks began in the theater where I saw this show. So it was a very cool full circle moment.
Number one, how did you discover that story? And number two, how do you know if Angela Lansbury has seen the stage musical?
I don't fully remember how I first discovered it. I did read an interview with the actress who plays Eglantine on stage where they talked about that in advance of the tour coming to Belfast. And I don't know if Angela has seen it. I would certainly hope that she would. She has not always been very receptive to her work being revisited. She's been very critical of, I think, every remake of a movie that she was ever in. So I don't know how she would feel about it, but I would hope that she would see it and love it. That's
interesting. I wouldn't expect that from her. First of all, and what other movies, what other roles of hers have been revisited?
The Manchurian Candidate, Meryl Streep plays her character in the remake, and she was sort of tough on that. There's Sweeney Todd. She was kind of tough on Helena Bonham Carter's performance as Mrs. Lovett. And then most interestingly, in the most recent Beauty and the Beast, the remake, the live action Beauty and the Beast, she was kind of critical of Emma Thompson's turn as Mrs. Potts, which is interesting because Angela Lansbury and Emma Thompson are quite good friends in real life and have worked together in numerous projects. So I was very shook when Angela Lansbury made sort of disparaging comments about it.
Wow. So she's just sassy. I like it. All right. Yeah. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Anything else you want to add about the musical or anything Bedknobs and Broomsticks before we jump into some trivia?
Let's play some trivia.
Do you know the answer? Get your brain gears churning and play along. It's trivia time.
Now, Aaron, before we jump into the trivia, I want to give a quick shout out to Taylor Mouser, the newest patron of Disney Coast to Coast. If any of you would like to become a patron of DCTC and gain rewards like advance access to episodes and live stream Q&As with me, in fact, this month is a live stream Q&A month, check out all of the different ways you can support DCTC and gain rewards at the same time by visiting the Patreon link in this episode's description. And don't forget that anyone who joins this month, May of 2022, I'll be matching 100% of your subscriber level to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Now, Aaron, would you like to hit me with a trivia question first, or shall I hit you?
You hit me.
Alrighty. In the opening credits of the movie, I noticed the name Milt Larsen as a technical consultant on the film. Now, Bedknobs and Broomsticks is full of cinematic illusions, which is where I presume Milt used his skills for the film. Milt Larsen is still indeed known for magic and illusions in a very major way. What is Milt Larsen's current connection to magic?
Oh my gosh.
This is tough.
This is very tough. I don't think I'm going to be able to answer the question, but I do have kind of a fun little nugget to share along the same line, which is that as you see the opening credits and the tapestry, and there are these different illustrations that appear next to each person's name, there's a very deep significance to each illustration. So, for example, I think there's like director of lighting, and then there's a wizard with a lantern, and there's like a projection going through his lantern and the illustration beside him. And then when it gets to the technical parts of the credits, you see these different medieval tradesmen doing their various crafts, and each one sort of corresponds to the credit being given on screen at that time. But all that to say, Milt Larsen, is it? What is his current? He must be very old now. I don't know. Is he involved in ILM?
Nope. He is the owner of the Magic Castle in Los Angeles.
Oh.
Yeah, and he is. I've met him many times there, and very often Dick Sherman's there, because they're very good friends. And, he was, in fact, you can see Milt in the documentary, The Boys, the Sherman Brothers story, and his interviews were shot in the Magic Castle. But yeah, he's the owner of the Magic Castle.
That's so cool. You have to take me and introduce me, and then we can talk Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
I haven't been to Magic Castle in years, but I can totally make that happen. The next time you're in town, we should do it. Just get ready for a very fancy night. Bring a suit, because you need a suit to get it.
I can do that.
Alrighty. That's my trivia question for you. What's yours for me?
Okay. In candor, I wrote 4, so let me pick one of these.
Of course you did.
Okay. Here's a good one, I think. The voice of the bear on the island of Dabumbu who fishes the bed out of the lagoon. That same voice can be heard in Disneyland on what attraction?
What's so annoying is when I was watching the film, I said to myself, I know this voice, but now I can't hear it, and I did not jot down who I thought it was. It's in an attraction at Disneyland, you said?
Yeah. Not just Disneyland.
Okay. Well, is it a Fantasyland dark ride?
No.
I don't think it's the maybe, is it the Haunted Mansion?
No.
It's Pirates?
No.
I have no idea.
You've not been in the right land.
Not area
yet.
of the park?
Think Frontierland.
Is he the wildest ride in the wilderness?
He sure is.
Is he really?
Yeah. His name's Dallas McKinnon, and that's his voice.
Interesting. Huh. I'm wondering if that's I just remember hearing it and be like, this voice sounds so familiar. I might have to go back and revisit that and check that out. Do you want to ask me another one of your 4?
Okay.
Or
I'll give you one more of the 4. This one I think should be easy from context clues, but we'll see. On what very appropriate day of the calendar did Angela Lansbury sign her contract to play Eglantine Price?
You're asking me about like war history here, aren't you? Is it related to something in the... No?
No, I think witchiness.
Oh, Halloween?
Halloween, October 31st, 1969. Very interestingly, Disney, in casting the role of Mary Poppins, they had considered Angela Lansbury, but ultimately gave the offer to Julie Andrews, who, as we all know, accepted and won an Oscar for it. When they later went to make Bedknobs and Broomsticks, they asked Julie Andrews to come back to play Eglantine Price. She passed. So then they offered it to Angela Lansbury. Angela signed the contract on Halloween, and shortly thereafter, Julie Andrews came back to the studio and said, I changed my mind. I want to play Eglantine Price, but it was too late.
And then Angela Lansbury took the Julie Andrews role in Mary Poppins Returns.
Yes. So there's been this like very cool back and forth between those two in these roles, which is also interesting because they are very good friends in real life. And they did a number of like 1-hour comedy specials on TV together in the 60s. You can find them on YouTube where they even do like Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady musical performances. They are wonderful to watch.
Wow. Have you met Angela Lansbury?
Oh, no, Jeff, I've tried. I wish, but no, I have not. Have you?
Gosh, I don't know. I feel like I've probably been. Yes, I did at the 25th. Yes. In fact, I did with Bradley Pierce, who is the voice of Chip, at the 25th anniversary screening of Beauty and the Beast at, where the heck was it? it might have been the Motion Picture Academy. I think. But yeah, I did meet her now that I think of it.
Was it magical?
I just felt like I was talking to a teapot. It was wonderful.
Yeah. You know what? I didn't really meet her, but she waved at me once. So I one time flew to Washington, D.C. just to see her in Blithe Spirit, which is a play that she toured for a number of years, maybe, 2016 or something like that. And I did the whole stage door, and she came out and spoke to us as a crowd. And, she was all of a foot away from me and sort of waved. And I have a picture of me standing right next to her. So that's the closest I've gotten.
Nice. Well, that's fun. Excellent. She's like, what, over 90 now or just turned 90?
I think so. Somewhere around there. Yeah.
Bless that woman. My goodness. Excellent. Well, Aaron, this has been so much fun. I love talking to you about this stuff. I love that you indulge me, even though sometimes I don't have the nicest things to say about things you love. But, you're a good friend for that. So before I let you go, anything you want to plug?
No, I'm glad that you've seen the movie now, Jeff, so that I can at least talk to you about it, and you may not want to hear it, but we'll have that available to us in the future.
I'll tell you what I do want. Anytime you see a reference to it in a Disney park, I want a text from you pointing it out to me.
Okay, that text won't come to you very often, but it'll be all the more meaningful when it does, right?
You never know. Listen, I bought a 30th anniversary Newsies pin at Disneyland recently, and never in a million years did I think that was going to happen.
Hey, me too. And they were selling the Bedknobs pins. So among other things, the 50th anniversary has brought us several Bedknobs pins, one of which was exclusive to the event I attended. And it was sort of the sister pin to the more widely available D23 pin that is sold to the general public via Shop Disney in limited number. They also had it at Disneyland along with the very Newsies pin that you're referencing. And I did buy both of those.
So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of it.
You're right. You're right. My mind is continually blown with Disney projects that I never thought would see the light of day. And then lo and behold, they happen.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. This has been... Oh, wait, did you plug anything? Do you want to plug anything?
Yeah. Find me online at aaronwallaceonline.com. I've written a few books about Walt Disney World, Magic Kingdom, and Epcot specifically, as well as the movie Hocus Pocus, since we just talked all about Disney witchiness. If you like Disney, if you like witches, check out my book, Hocus Pocus in Focus, which you can find on my website, on Amazon, or wherever books are sold.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Aaron. I will talk to you later.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Disney with a Z, coast to coast, on your favorite podcast app. This episode has been executive produced by Robert Scontrino. Gain rewards like Robert, including access to never-before-heard episodes and live-stream Q&As by visiting the Patreon link in this episode's description. Basically, anything you need can be found in this episode's description, from additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!
Thanks for listening to Disney Coast to Coast. Have a magical day.
Disney Coast to Coast is produced and hosted by Jeff DePauli. Learn more about the podcast and become a supporter at DisneyCoastToCoast.com. This podcast is part of the DePodcast Network. Learn more about this show, plus find more quality and entertaining podcasts at DePodcastNetwork.com. That's DEPodcastNetwork.com.